stuff.
Yeah. Like, what if
Peanut
I
butter
start
just
crying
check it
right
out.
now? She's gonna see me and
He feels so bad.
He feels so bad.
All right. When it comes to speciation, we can distinguish between two different kinds. Two different kinds. That was
What was that?
two different kinds. We can talk about allopatric speciation and sympatric speciation. Allopatric, translated, I think it's Latin or something, comes from the term different country. Two separate countries or two separate geographical places. Allopatric speciation is very easy to understand. There's a physical separation, a geographic separation between the two groups. Somehow they got separated. They're not interbreeding anymore. We no longer have gene flow between them. And they're speciating into separate species. Okay, that makes sense. Allopatric. So the barrier could be water, could be mountains, could be distance, whatever. Lots of examples of that, and I'll show you some of them in a second. Okay, the other one is harder to understand. That's sympatric speciation, but it kind of deals with those factors we talked about with those reproductive barriers we talked about. They explain some of that, and I'll give you some examples. Yes?
So like what happens if like two species, like one species forms off to make two species, but somehow those two species somewhat like migrate back. So I think what they form.
Okay, so that's going to form a hybrid zone. So where the two groups actually come into contact again, we form a hybrid zone where the hybrids are in that region of land, or water I guess, where they touch. Here you have species A, here you have species B, here you have the hybrid zone where you see a lot of hybrids. A lot of the time those hybrids are not successful. They don't do well, but they pop up in this area because there happens to be coincidental matings between the two very, very similar species.
Then what happens if
This doesn't happen between, let's say, like deer and rabbits.
But fish.
We're not talking about that.
no, like
We're
say-
talking about like white-tailed deer and a really close relative of
Yeah.
white-tailed deer
It's
or
okay.
whatever. You know what I mean? That's very, very close. The hybrids don't do as well.
Then what happens if the hybrids do well?
Well, then we have something that's called fusion,
Okay.
where they come back together, and I've talked about that before, where you thought these were separate species, but they really weren't. Because the hybrids that reproduce successful offspring, guess what? They're not actually hybrids. They're still the same species, so
No.
therefore those A and B weren't actually A and B, they were just A and A prime. Yeah.
What did you say the new one was, the second one was called?
Sympatric. So sympatric means same country. They're all living together, and they're in the same vicinity, yet they're not interbreeding anymore because of those barriers. Okay? And they can speciate for a variety of different reasons. And the one that's a little tougher to understand, but I'm going to try to simplify it for us. Hopefully I'll be successful. We're here in realms of biology that I am not an expert on. Okay, so I'm kind of winging it here, and I'm hoping you're going to be kind about it. But I'll do my best. Here's what we got. Polyploidy can cause speciation very quickly. When I say polyploidy, I mean extra sets of chromosomes, where you have a mistaken meiosis, and instead of having a 1N sperm or egg, one of the eggs maybe is 2N. It's supposed to be 1N, but it's 2N. Which means your offspring is going to be 3N, triploid, instead of diploid. Following me? This doesn't really happen in animals because animals can't survive that. We couldn't survive that. The cell would just die. But in plants, it happens all the time. The triploid plant can survive. Well, guess what? If this plant over here is triploid, and this one is diploid, and this one's diploid, they might not be able to be successful with their pollen and their eggs to be able to breed with each other. Which means as soon as you form this triploid plant, you formed a new species accidentally, very quickly. And another triploid formed over here. Well, guess what? These two, if a triploid pollen and this triploid egg come together, they might do just fine. They might be okay. So this polyploidy thing can happen in plants where there's just a simple mistake in meiosis. Chromosomes didn't separate. You made an egg or a sperm that was triploid. It's more likely to be the egg, but that's triploid or diploid. And now all of a sudden you got a triploid plant. But you can also sometimes form tetraploid or octaploid plants. So if you look at the plants we have now that we use for like agriculture, a lot of them are tetraploid or more sets of chromosomes. Remember when I talked to you about that idea of how much DNA is and how many chromosomes are in each different species? And I said humans have 46, we have so much DNA. And then there's this weird plant that has like a rice or whatever we talked about that has way more DNA than a human. It's because of that. It's because of polyploidy. Because it has multiple sets of chromosomes that it wasn't really supposed to have to start with. But plants can survive that. They're much more, they don't care as much about that stuff. They're more, what's the word I'm looking for? Tolerant of that? Versatile, yeah. They're much tougher about that kind of stuff. Animals are more sensitive when it comes to that. So that's polyploidy. Our textbook distinguishes between autopolyploid and allopolyploid. Don't worry about that. They will not ask you that on the test, so let's not worry about it now. Okay, so we're not going to waste a whole bunch of time talking about stuff that you're not going to get asked about. Instead, let's keep forging ahead so we can successfully finish all the curriculum that we got to finish before the test. So we have a little time to review at the end and go into that test on May 14th with great confidence. Speaking of great confidence for May 14th, how's that AP Classroom free response set of questions coming along? One I assigned pre-spring break.
I did my 12.
Yeah? I think we need to start checking that pretty soon. There was, I think, 29 questions total. I just went through it again, and I noticed a lot of my questions were actually fragmented questions, where it was just like one part of a larger question, so they're fairly short. So it's not as bad as it looks. It's still a lot of work. It's still horrible. It's still a nightmare, but it's not as bad of a nightmare as I thought it was at first. So your first 12 should be done already. And we say the next 8, so up to 20 within the next week.
Can we not?
Maybe right after you're done with the test on Tuesday, you can get on those. Please? This isn't me being mean to you. This is me just telling you we got to get prepped for that test. It's going to take a lot of time. It's going to take a lot of work until the end.
Yeah.
I shall barely get it. All right. Okay. Another way that Sympatric speciation can happen that we already talked about, haven't had differentiation. Here's just another example, which is a fly that feeds on apples. We don't need to worry about the example. Sexual selection is another good example that can drive Sympatric speciation because the females will simply reject certain males, even if they're right there. If this male is right there, but he's the wrong color, she's going to reject him. That's going to drive a wedge, a reproductive wedge between those two groups. A good example of that is the cichlid that lives in, let me actually show you here. Hold on, I'm going to go back to this again. Oh my God, I got my slides all out of whack here. Okay, this kind of cichlid that lives in Lake Victoria, I believe it is, or is it Lake, is this Lake Tanganyika in Africa? I don't remember. Well, anyway, Pundamilia Nairai and Pundamilia. Names so nice, they named it twice. They come in blue and they come in red. Okay? A mutation caused some of the blue ones to become red. Same species, just a different color variant. Eventually what happened is the females rejected the red ones and only made it with the blue ones, or these other females that also had a mutation, by luck, by coincidence, preferred the red ones. So the red preferring females breed with these guys. The blue preferring females breed with these guys. Pretty soon, there's a reproductive wedge that forms. Ignore this hybrid here. That's a whole other situation where they talk about if the water is clear, different things happen than if the water is cloudy. If the water is turbid, in other words, if it's cloudy, guess what? The color doesn't matter anymore. The females don't care about the color as much because they can't see that well. But if the water is clear in regions of the lake where the water is clear, then the color matters and it drives them apart. So this you can ignore. That's not. I just wanted to see have you see the pictures of the fish on the road. This is a popular fish in the aquarium trade. A lot of people keep these in their tanks, African cichlid tanks, because I mean, you can see why. Pretty beautiful fish. Pretty awesome looking. Pundamilia, type of cichlid. Polyploidy we talked about. Here's a nice little diagram that shows you the difference between allopatric and sympatric. Allopatric is actually a separation geographically. Sympatric there isn't. Just a little cartoon. Here's a good example of allopatric speciation where there's a frog species that started out down here off of the coast of Africa where India is in Madagascar. This red thing is Madagascar, the blue thing is former, like India where it used to start with tectonic movement. What do they call it? Tectonic? Plate tectonics, or plate, what do they call it? Is there some drift or something? Continental drift, that's it.
There you go.
Continental drift, okay? So India goes slamming up into Asia very rudely, uninvited, just slams right into Asia up here and causes the Himalayas to form. It's carrying along certain frogs that were stuck on this chunk of land and drifted up with that whole movement. The Madagascar frogs stayed behind. All right, so here we got the Madagascar ones, they're like yellowish green. We got these other ones that are brown, we got the other one, and then they're now separate species. But they all came from one ancestral species over millions of years ago here. 80 million, wow, okay, it goes back to 80, 100 million years, wow, that's pretty long. Alrighty then. I just really think it's super fascinating that India didn't used to be a part of that continent and that actually stuck itself on there. That's crazy how that happened. Diane Dodd did some experiments that deal with allopatric speciation. Diane Dodd is a scientist that worked with fruit flies. She fed some of them, she took the same species of fruit fly, Drosophila melanogaster, separated them, fed some of them starch and fed some of them maltose. She kept them that way for years. Starch feeding, maltose feeding. Okay, eventually she put them together, 40 generations, well maybe it's not even years, 40 generations is like maybe a year or two. She puts them back together, guess what? The starch ones preferred starch-eating flies when they were mating. The starch females wanted to only mate with starch males. The maltose females wanted to mate with maltose males. Allopatric speciation happening that quickly, that fast. Now, they were still the same species. They still were compatible. They didn't form a new species yet. But if this is allowed to continue for 10 years, 100 years, are you with me? Eventually, those flies are going to be new species. They cannot interbreed anymore. All right, that's just her data. Maltose E. This is the effect of Google Slides trying to look at PowerPoint. Like, really, Google? You can't put the E up there?
Maltose.
Like, Maltose E.
Well,
Yeah.
that's really annoying.
Thank
I like
you.
that.
That's what I call design.
It's like, learn to code, says the guy who doesn't know how to code.
Is this still for
Harvard
the hybrid zones?
offers a free coding class.
Is this still part of the hybrid zones?
No, I really haven't touched hybrid zones yet, except I mentioned it before.
Okay.
So hybrid zones, here's a good example of like a toad, red-bellied toad or whatever, or fire-bellied frog or whatever the hell they're called, toad something. What happens with them is you got two different variants. You got the yellow-bellied toad, you got the fire-bellied toad, Bambina, named sometimes they named it twice. Bambina variegata. I do not need to know these names. They live in southeastern Europe, Asia / whatever. And there's a region where the hybrids form. Okay, so our hybrid zone is actually kind of curvy. That's where they meet and breed and form hybrids. All right, and there's several things that can happen. One is reinforcement. Reinforcement means the hybrids just either die or they're sterile. And the reinforcement of the speciation continues, that the two separate species get more pronouncedly different. Or fusion, which we talked about. They come back together, they were just one species all along. They're not going to speciate then. That's another possibility. Or stability, where the hybrids are okay, they survive, but they don't go one way or another. Okay, so you got species A, you got species B, and you got your hybrids, and they live just fine. That's stability. But that's more, I think this is more unusual. Okie doke. Eldridge and Gould are some scientists that came up with a fairly important concept in evolution. It's called punctuated equilibrium. So we used to think that evolution was always very slow and that it just happened very gradually over thousands and millions of years. And we couldn't really see the events happening very quickly. Eldridge and Gould realized that evolution is very slow. That's true. Stasis. Nothing much happening. But then when there's a quick environmental change, evolution happens very fast. That's punctuated equilibrium. You've got equilibrium for a long time, and then all of a sudden it jumps. that evolution happens very quickly. And a great example of that is the Cambrian explosion. About 550 million years ago, a huge amount of species suddenly appeared very quickly. That's the explosion of numbers of species. And that's because of environmental changes, and the conditions were just right that a whole lot of different forms of life started to form. Vertebrate life, fish, amphibians, very rapidly. When I say rapidly, I mean a few million years versus waiting hundreds and hundreds of million years or billion years. So I know when I say 500,000 years or 20 million years, it sounds like a long time, but it's very short when it comes to the age of the Earth. Are you showing me something?
Yeah, the Cambrian explosion is on my interesting thing.
Oh, that's, I can't read it that far away, it's too small, but that's actually one of the things you have typed up. Unrelated to what I just said, you already had that on there before.
Yeah.
Nice. Is that a Baader-Meinhof example? Do we have two now? Maybe. It could be.
Oh.
But you knew about the Cambrian explosion before. It's not like this is the first time. Okay, so that's maybe not Baader-Meinhof then. But the coyotes eating donkeys? No. What is it again? Donkeys eat coyotes. I've never heard of that in my life, and now I heard it twice in 2 days. It's the most amazing thing ever.
Yeah.
That made my Friday right there. That was amazing. Okay, so Gould and Eldridge, punctuated equilibrium. Looks kind of like this. Gradual, this is the old kind of approach that, yes, that does happen sometimes, but this is very common. Where nothing happens for a long time and then also get the two species. And that's it for chapter 24. We did it. All we now have to do is cover all of chapter 25 in 5 minutes.
Yeah, that's what happened.
Which is doable if I simply say your notes, your textbook, and your slide deck await you. They're already on Google Classroom. Okay?
Is it typical? Does it go along with black holes?
That would mean I'd have to go home and make a video and like, no.
Yes.
It's me time.
Is it typical?
Hey, let me show you some of the highlights. Is that okay? I'll show you some of the highlights. We got a few minutes. Oh, the notes are over there, so let's pass here. I'll have to get some volunteers to pass these out while I set up my slides. Okay, are you guys like really, really adamant about not doing the test on Tuesday?
Yeah.
I mean, I won't be here Friday, so.
How does that help?
I don't know. I'm gonna be at dance. I'm gonna be at dance. I'm gonna be
All right, I'm just going to make a decision. We're going to have the test Friday, but we start new material on Tuesday.
Do us for bird videos. It's so cool.
Not that one? Oh, can we talk about that after? It's on your list? Thanks, guys. Everybody got a sheet?
I think so. Anybody?
Did I get one? I didn't even give myself one.
People are very curious about the origin of life. We could get into religious realms. We could get into all kinds of discussions about that. Where did the first cell come from? Where did the first living organism come from? If there was no living organism on the ancient Earth, that's a very difficult question to answer. That's very difficult. A number of scientists have done research trying to create life in the lab. They have not been successful. But one of the famous experiments was done in '52 by Miller and Urey where they actually were able to produce amino acids with components that they believe were in the primordial soup in the ocean at the time on Earth, at 3.6 billion years ago. They applied electrical shocks to the system, sparks like lightning, heat, all kinds of things like that, and they found that amino acids could form spontaneously from water, methane, ammonia, and hydrogen gas, which is impressive. However, amino acids are not living organisms. Okay, so it's evidence that it maybe could happen, but it's not absolute evidence that it did happen. So anyway, in terms of ages of fossils, we talked about the fossil record before. I think it would be helpful if you understood the concept of radiometric dating and half-lives and how that works to figure out how old a fossil is. And how we know that life started 3.6 billion years ago. How do we know that the Cambrian explosion was 550 million years ago? How do we know the dinosaurs were extinct 65 million years ago? It's through radiometric dating using radioactive isotopes like uranium, carbon-14, potassium, things like that. Are you with me? The thing is that carbon dating has a very limited half-life, it has a very limited time frame. Carbon's half-life is 5,730 years. So we can't measure anything that's older than 70,000 years with carbon dating, which means any dinosaur bones, you cannot use carbon dating because all the carbon has decayed into nitrogen gas at that point, and it's no longer there. And so carbon dating is good for like artifacts like bases from 6,000 years ago, things like that, bones of like mammoths and things like that. Were there still mammoths 70,000 years ago?
Probably.
I think there were.
Nuh-uh. Yeah.
Yes, they died on that.
Right, they were fairly recent, right?
Yeah, you're right. That's all.
Anyway, if you look at a really,
Hey, you don't have to pick up.
If they want to talk to you,
Ask me one of the
oops, one second.
it's literally all
Allie.
you.
Allie. This is the fourth. Are you kidding me?
Let's-
It's almost over, Allie. Come on.
Let's assume, pick it up, pick it
It's the
up.
phone, Allie.
Tell them I said hi.
Jeez, was I not being clear what I wanted her to do?
No.
I went like this and like that, right?
I did not see you see that.
I know what you wanted to do, to be
Can we
honest.
take a break?
Are you coming back? Are you coming back?
Allie, please.
Oh, excellent, that's actually a good idea. We could take a break, come back, finish 25, have a test Tuesday.
No, like,
I'm willing to do that.
I'm not.
I mean,
I
there's
will
a
make
do
her
that.
dance.
You and your dance.
I was almost not gonna
Enough
come.
with the dance. Enough with the
I
dance.
was almost not gonna come today, but I told my mom.
When
I'm
the
coming.
imposter is
All right, let's assume you got a dinosaur fossil, a real old one, but living organisms don't have uranium. There's no uranium in them. So how are you going to use uranium dating to figure out the age of that fossil? You okay?
Yeah, I'm good.
Oh, it's not like horrible news? Your rabbit died or something? Nothing like that?
Was it?
Wave 1 is dismissed. Wave 1.
wait, we gotta wipe our desks now. We
How do you figure out, I'll take care of this. How do you figure out the age of that fossil when it has no uranium
I
in it?
really want to help you wipe your desk.
You don't figure it out.
Potassium.
Yeah, exactly. You look for uranium-containing rocks that are close to the fossil, that are in the same layer, and you can figure out how old that fossil is. Are you with me?
No.
Yes, I get it.
I'm not.
Well, if you have a rock that's right next to that fossil that formed at the same time, and you see the rock is 2 billion years old, that tells you that fossil is also 2 billion
How do
years
you
old.
see that it is though?
Because it's in the same layer, it formed at the same
How do
time.
you know that layer's 2 billion?
That's a discussion we'll have another time,
Sentimental rock.
Okay.
after your dad's out. Okay?
You know, a lot of
We know that the Earth's magnetic field switches every so often. Are you with me? So we can look at magnetic particle containing rocks to see which way they're facing, to be able to tell, was this rock formed before that field reversal or after? Every so many 100,000 years or whatever, did you know that the magnetic North Pole isn't always up there, it flips back and forth? Yeah. Crazy. So you can use that as an indication of how old the rock is. When you look at the, what do you call the little, Carruthers, forgive me, but I forgot, what do you call the particle that's magnetic in the iron? I'm sorry.
Magnesium.
Dipole or something. Yeah, sure, sure. Whatever. Okay.
Maybe it is magnesium. It sounds like a
We
magnesium.
haven't even called wave 2 yet, which means I might as well keep going.
Right now.
Alright, this we're going to skip, but this kind of gives you an idea of what existed at what time, a nice little timeline, some crazy stuff in the old days.
Wave 2.
Hallucinogenia is crazy, that's one you might want to, hey, you might want to add that to your list, hallucinogenia. I hope you have tictolic on your list. Alright, fossil formation, more timeline stuff, more time. Oh, we're zipping through this chapter like nothing, look at this. This is good stuff. So 3.5 billion is first life, 3.6 billion. Eukaryotes, 2.1 billion, bam. Multicellular, 1.2. Cambrian explosion, roughly 550. This kind of points out the importance. So first, Earth was formed, first life. 2.7 is first photosynthetic creatures, first multicellular. I'm sorry, this is first eukaryotes with a nucleus, first multicellular. Cambrian explosion, dinosaurs went extinct. What's the 1 million years ago?
Caveman? Bronze?
Yeah, human-like ancestors, not Homo sapiens yet, but Homo erectus, Homo habilis, some of those guys existed at this time, and then less than 1 million Homo sapiens. You guys all know Homo sapiens?
Yes, sir.
All right, this is an interesting one. How do we know about photosynthesis? How do we know that photosynthesis evolved 2.7 billion years ago?
Because at 2.8 you couldn't find it.
Once oxygen formed in the atmosphere, what else formed with iron-containing minerals? Rust. It's the first time we see iron oxide in the deposits, and if you look at this, you see the iron oxide red rust layers. The only way that rust could have formed is with oxygen in the atmosphere. That tells you that photosynthesis came here. Because you can tell all of that rock is bigger than Interesting. Interesting. Oh, this is actually super
Wave
important.
3 is
Ah.
Wave
Hold, help me with this question.
Let me finish this yesterday.
No, you got a pre-boarded warehouse. Please,
Okay,
hold.
that's Friday, see you Tuesday.
Help me with this.
Damn. Why can't you? Can you just email me? Can you email me? Okay,
I don't know if you're gonna know the answer to it, but there were
That's
just
all I
questions
want.
I had. So, wait, you guys are gonna ask us if you know the
This is all wrong. Max explained to me, I was saying.
I'm gonna go.
Correct.
one of the real black holes. They're really tiny.
What's up?
Nice match.
So then I still feel like there's some reason match this, but now I'm getting stuck with.
This is all fine and good, but it's only good if you know what it is.
Right?
Okay, so we're gonna just look at the problem and look at the things that's useful.
Galaxies, like, not galaxies, I'm like,
Okay, so 220 red,
in the
that's
Milky Way
useful.
galaxy, ours
320
is called,
not very useful.
Centuries A. And they can hold like
Okay, so red
millions of
is,
suns mass. It's
red
really
must be the center.
It's
That tells you that
chilly outside.
these guys are MM,
Is it your mom?
okay? And homozygous Y must be MW. Okay, that tells you that, so which one do you want to make P? You have to decide one of them is P. So let's say black. Black is P, white is Q, and perfect. Let's do that. That tells you we have Q, we can figure out Q squared, and we can figure out R squared. And we'll figure this out later. Okay, so MM, we said was R. Okay, so you're going to say R squared is 220 over the total. 1640. So now we can figure out R. So that's easy. Okay, and then Q. Q is one of those void.
She's not there yet. She's in here now.
Once you have Q and R, you can figure out P.
Okay.
Because you take 1 minus that. And then anything else it asks, how many individuals are homozygous black? all you have to do then is figure out the number of MVs and
I have my mom.
it's going to be E squared.
Wait,
Hope your car is
It's actually
I hope it works.
it's not yet.
not a half.
But what's confusing?
Not how stuff to keep that.
When I send you,
so weird.
you have to.
No, you don't have to go there. You just showed you how to, you like derive the whole formula. You didn't have to do it. You can solve
Why
this
would I
without
send a
doing
picture of
that.
the email I sent to him?
Once
I
you know
don't
what
know,
you
maybe you
these
changed
are,
your mind.
what you know
You're
what this is,
indecisive.
you know, let's say it asks for header,
Yeah.
which it does, it asks for gray. So a gray one is a black one and a white one, right? That's called incomplete dominance. You guys want to listen in on this in case you trivial? You guys know how to do trivial? The ones that Ensign taught?
When Ensign did it, yeah.
Yeah. Let me shut this off over again.
Oh, did you forget to